What happens when late-night comedy stops being funny and starts becoming a weapon? And what if the guest isn't there to play along, but to push back? The night Matt Walsh walked onto Jimmy Kimmel's set, no one could have predicted how fast it would all fall apart. The lights buzzed above the Jimmy Kimmel Live studio, casting their usual glossy glow over the polished set. The audience, primed for laughter, clapped along to the band's opening riff. But behind the scenes, things felt off. Kimmel flipped through his cue cards with a look less amused than calculated. Producers exchanged tight glances. "Tonight might get a little messy," one crew member whispered. In the green room, Matt Walsh adjusted his tie, nodding politely at a PA who refused to meet his eyes. His assistant, watching the stage feed, leaned in and murmured, "They're setting something up." The countdown hit 0. Kimmel's voice boomed. "Joining us tonight, he calls himself a truth teller. Others call him something less flattering, Matt Walsh." Polite applause followed, but it wasn't quite right. Too restrained. Almost rehearsed. Walsh stepped out, composed and steady, offering a handshake that Kimmel met with exaggerated charm. To the audience, it seemed like just another interview, but tension cracked beneath the surface like glass under pressure. No one yet knew that within minutes, this wouldn't be a debate. It would be an unraveling, not just of civility, but of the illusion that late night was still neutral ground. Matt Walsh walked onto the stage with deliberate calm, his expression unreadable. He wasn't here to perform. He wasn't here to charm. He was here because his team had booked the appearance as part of a media push for his latest documentary, one already lighting up debate circles online. Jimmy Kimmel, on the other hand, greeted him with a wide grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Matt Walsh, ladies and gentlemen," he said, gesturing like a ringmaster to a reluctant lion. The handshake was firm but short. Kimmel motioned to the guest chair, but Matt didn't sit right away. He scanned the audience briefly, some clapping, some hesitating, some clearly unsure how to respond. He knew that look. It was the same expression people wore before a storm. When he finally took his seat, his body language was guarded. Kimmel shuffled his cards. "So, Matt," he began, voice syrupy smooth, "you've had quite a week on Twitter." Laughter followed, forced and uneven. The opening salvo was clear. This wasn't going to be friendly. Matt nodded slowly, choosing his words with care. "I've had many weeks like that, Jimmy." His tone was level, but his eyes didn't blink. Kimmel chuckled, but the warmth had already evaporated. Somewhere off stage, a producer leaned toward a control panel, whispering, "We've got friction already." And just like that, the segment shifted. No more soft pitches. The gloves were already off, and Jimmy hadn't even asked his real question yet. The early banter was over almost before it began. Kimmel barely acknowledged Matt's answer before pivoting. "Let's talk about your film," he said, voice bright but with an unmistakable edge. The one that's been called transphobic, inflammatory, and, well, dangerous. Congratulations on the controversy, I guess? The audience gave a mixed reaction, some laughter, some uncomfortable shifting in their seats. Matt's jaw tightened just enough to register. Matt didn't flinch. "It's been called all those things by people who haven't watched it," he replied coolly. "But that's par for the course in today's media climate, right?" He wasn't smiling, and Kimmel didn't appreciate it. His smirk wavered, then returned, thinner now. "So you're saying you're misunderstood?" he asked. "Because a lot of people say you're just plain wrong." It wasn't a question. It was a setup. The kind Walsh had seen dozens of times, but rarely this early into an interview. Behind the cameras, a producer crossed his arms. This was unfolding faster than expected. Matt leaned forward slightly, his voice lower. "What I'm saying is, if you want to have a conversation, let's do that. But if you're here to repeat Twitter headlines, I don't think we'll get very far." The room tensed. Jimmy chuckled, but it sounded strained. He wasn't used to guests confronting him directly. And this wasn't just confrontation. It was defiance, quiet and unwavering. Something that didn't play well under studio lights, or with hosts who expected control. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, smirk intact, but the rhythm was already off. "You've built a whole career off of being contrarian," he said, his tone laced with mockery. "But don't you ever wonder if maybe you're just wrong?" The audience laughed, but it didn't come naturally. There was hesitation in it, the kind of laughter that checks for permission. Matt, unfazed, folded his hands and gave a small nod. The air was thick now, not with excitement, but discomfort. Is it contrarian? Matt replied. To ask basic questions no one seems willing to answer? Or is that just inconvenient for people with talk shows and applause signs? A ripple passed through the studio. Jimmy blinked. He hadn't expected a counterpunch that sharp. He tried to recover with a grin. So now you're accusing me of being part of some grand conspiracy? He said, chuckling as if it were absurd. But his voice betrayed a flicker of irritation. Matt didn't take the bait. No, he said. I'm saying this format, this entire setting makes it easy to distort truth and hide behind the crowd. The audience shifted again. Some clapped, a few booed, others simply sat in stunned silence. Offstage, a camera operator muttered, "This is going south." But it wasn't chaos yet. It was something more dangerous, controlled tension spiraling towards something no one in the room could stop. Jimmy knew it, and so did Matt, and neither was going to back down first. Jimmy flipped a cue card and paused, as if weighing how far he wanted to go. Then came the pivot. Not to comedy, not to the film, but to Matt's family. You've said you're raising your kids with traditional values, Jimmy began, tone feigning curiosity. Do they know their dad's on the wrong side of history? The audience laughed harder this time, encouraged by the jab. Matt's eyes darkened, but his expression remained controlled. That control was the threat, and Jimmy could feel it. I don't think teaching my kids to value truth and responsibility puts me on the wrong side of anything, Matt replied, unless, of course, truth itself is now offensive. Jimmy raised his eyebrows theatrically. Well, some would say it's your version of the truth that's the problem. The crowd chuckled again, louder this time, sensing Jimmy was gaining ground, or at least trying to. But Matt's silence in response lingered just a beat too long. It wasn't surrender, it was restraint. Backstage, a floor manager leaned toward the showrunner. He's not cracking, she whispered. On set, the tension was no longer subtle. Matt finally spoke again, low and unflinching. This was supposed to be a conversation. If you brought me here just to make a scene, say so. Jimmy scoffed. If this is a scene, you're writing the script. The line got laughs, but under the laughter was something else, the unmistakable sense that the script wasn't going to end the way anyone expected. And Jimmy had just lost control of the page. The cameras kept rolling, but the smiles on stage were vanishing fast. Jimmy leaned forward, eyes narrowing, voice sharpened with a faux casualness. Tell me, Matt, do you actually believe what you say, or is it just good branding? The audience tittered, not entirely sure if it was meant as a joke. Matt gave a tight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. If you're asking whether I mean what I say, yes, I live it. I don't hide behind writers and applause cues. That was the first visible crack in Jimmy's veneer. The smile twitched, his eyes hardened. The crowd stirred, sensing they'd stepped out of the safe zone. Jimmy chuckled stiffly, adjusting his suit jacket. Careful, Matt, he said. That sounded dangerously like an insult. Matt didn't blink. Just calling it like I see it. The pause that followed was loaded. Not the pause of dead air, but of two men realizing they weren't in the same interview anymore. They were in a standoff. From the control booth, a producer muttered, "We need a cut soon." But the floor director held off, eyes glued to the feed, sensing the virality forming in real time. Jimmy pressed again, louder now. You think you're the only one telling the truth. Everyone else is lying, right? The studio dimmed under the weight of the question. Matt leaned forward. I think most people are afraid to say what they actually believe. And when they do, this is what happens. The audience wasn't laughing anymore, they were listening. Jimmy shifted in his seat, visibly agitated now. The playful smugness that usually carried him through uncomfortable exchanges had given way to something more brittle. You know, you act like you're the only one with convictions, he said, tone biting. But conviction without compassion is just cruelty. The audience responded with a few cheers, eager to reset the energy, but the cheer didn't stick. It hovered, then evaporated. Matt didn't flinch. I don't come here with malice, Matt said quietly. I come with ideas. If those ideas make people uncomfortable, maybe that says more about the audience than the speaker. Jimmy leaned back, scoffing. That's convenient, isn't it? Hide behind uncomfortable truths whenever you're called out. A few more laughs from the crowd, forced, nervous. The studio was rapidly losing the script it depended on. Host dominant, guest defensive, everyone entertained. Backstage, a camera assistant whispered, "This isn't going to end clean." On set, Jimmy's tone sharpened. "So what? You think this is all rigged against you? That late night is some kind of ideological ambush?" Matt's answer came slowly, deliberately. "Not rigged. Just dishonest. And I think your audience deserves better." The silence that followed wasn't planned. It crept in like a warning. Kimmel's face tensed, the room frozen in an unnatural stillness. The show had started as an interview. It was becoming something else entirely, something live, raw, and far outside the network's control. "Wow," Jimmy said, forcing a laugh. "You really came here swinging, didn't you?" The comment was laced with something sharper than sarcasm. It was a veiled warning. The audience laughed, hesitantly this time, unsure if they were supposed to be enjoying this. Matt sat back in his chair, calm as ever. "I came here to talk. If I wanted to brawl, I'd be on cable news." His tone was even. His eyes weren't. Jimmy shifted again, visibly uncomfortable. The cue card in his hand trembled slightly as he glanced at the booth. He was losing the crowd. Worse, he was losing control of the set. So he smiled, wide and plastic. "We're going to take a quick break," he said suddenly, gesturing to the audience with false cheer. "When we come back, maybe Matt will teach us all how to make enemies on the internet." That got a bigger laugh, but it didn't land the way Jimmy hoped. As the cameras cut and the house lights dimmed, tension spilled into the room like smoke. Crew members rushed to their positions, stage hands whispered to each other. Matt didn't move. He stared straight ahead, jaw tight. Jimmy stood and made a beeline for the wings, whispering angrily to a producer. "He's hijacking this," he snapped. "We've got 7 more minutes. Either we pivot or we shut it down." But backstage voices were split. Some wanted to steer it back to neutral, others sensed a viral moment forming and knew it was already too late to reverse. The lights came back up. The audience cheered, but the energy was fractured. Some polite claps, others hesitant, a few outright silent. Jimmy plastered on his smile, but the tension hadn't faded. It had thickened. "We're back," he said, his voice a notch too loud, "with Matt Walsh, who's clearly not afraid to stir the pot." He turned to Matt. "So, Matt, tell me, when exactly did you decide empathy was optional?" The line drew gasps, no laughter. Matt didn't react right away. He let the silence hang, then leaned forward slightly. "When did we decide mockery was entertainment?" he asked. "You invited me here, not to talk, but to provoke. And I played along, until now." There was no mistaking the shift. The crowd went silent again. A few heads turned toward the control booth. This was no longer a comedy segment. It was something closer to live theater, with stakes. Jimmy tried to lighten it. "Oh, come on, Matt, we're just having a conversation." But even he didn't believe it. His voice lacked conviction. Matt replied coolly, "Then stop performing." That line hung in the air, sharp and surgical. Jimmy's smirk faded. Across the stage, a camera operator adjusted his focus. Not for the shot, but for what everyone now suspected might happen next. What had started as TV banter was unraveling in real time. And the host, for once, wasn't in command of the room. Jimmy's face twitched, barely, but enough to register. "I perform for millions every night," he said, voice lower now. "It's called being a host. Maybe if you did more listening and less lecturing, people would actually like you." It wasn't a joke. It was a dig, and it hit its target. The crowd's reaction was split. Some clapped nervously, others stayed silent. A few looked down at their phones, already texting what they were witnessing. Matt's gaze didn't move. "Popularity doesn't equal integrity," he replied. "If your job is to get laughs at the expense of honesty, maybe you're not hosting. Maybe you're hiding." That landed hard. Even Jimmy's most loyal staff backstage were murmuring now. The rhythm of the show was gone, replaced with something rawer, unscripted. The laugh signs flashed, but barely anyone responded. The illusion of control had been pierced, and Matt wasn't letting go. Jimmy leaned forward, elbows on the desk, his tone darkening. "Are you accusing me of being a fraud?" he asked, voice clipped. "Because if you are, say it plainly." Matt met his stare. "I'm saying that what you project here, this truth teller with a punchline act, collapses the moment someone challenges your premise." The words echoed. For a moment, no one moved. The studio had gone from spectacle to standoff, and there were still minutes left on the clock, long ones. Matt's last statement didn't just hang in the air, it carved through it. The studio, once buoyed by anticipation, now felt like a courtroom. Jimmy Kimmel sat rigid, expression neutral but eyes narrowed. The jokes had stopped. The rhythm was broken, and in that silence it was clear. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was confrontation, the kind you don't walk away from without consequences. Jimmy finally spoke, but his voice was quieter now, like he was recalibrating. "You're good at twisting things," he said. "You come on here, throw punches, and act like the victim when people respond." Matt shook his head. "I came here to speak. You turned it into a spectacle. Don't blame me because your audience expected a puppet and got a man instead." The line stunned the front row, a few clapped. Most just sat, frozen in their seats. A producer offstage gave the floor manager a panicked nod. They were about to pull the plug. But before the command could be relayed, Jimmy leaned in once more, his voice tight with something between anger and disbelief. "You're not walking out of here looking noble," he said. "This isn't your platform." Matt stood slowly, deliberately. "It never was," he replied. "That's the problem. And that's exactly why I'm done." The crowd gasped. Phones went up. Security began moving because everyone knew what came next wouldn't just go viral. It would rewrite the night's headline. Matt Walsh didn't flinch as security approached from the wings. The moment was live. The cameras hadn't cut. The crew was paralyzed between chaos and protocol. Jimmy's eyes darted toward the director's booth. "Cut the feed," someone whispered, but no one moved. The control room had frozen, transfixed by the tension they'd unintentionally unleashed. Walsh stood, hands at his sides, his expression calm, dangerously calm. Jimmy rose too, stepping from behind the desk, no longer playing host but protector of his stage. "You think this is how you make your point?" he said, voice raised for the first time. "You hijack a show, then walk off like a martyr?" Matt turned slightly toward the audience, not addressing them directly but letting his voice carry. "I didn't hijack anything, I answered your questions. You just didn't like the answers." Some audience members applauded, others booed, but none looked away. Phones were out, recordings were rolling. This wasn't just another interview, this was collapse in real time. One of the security guards hesitated. He wasn't just dealing with a guest anymore. He was navigating live optics, audience perception, and potential fallout. Matt raised a hand, not in surrender, but in signal. "I don't need to be escorted," he said. "I can see myself out." Jimmy opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The energy in the room had turned completely. The crowd wasn't cheering him anymore. In fact, many weren't even looking at him, they were looking at Matt. And just like that, the studio no longer belonged to the host. It belonged to the moment, to the man walking out not silenced, but amplified by the very attempt to shut him down. Matt Walsh stepped off stage without looking back. No wave, no parting shot. Just a slow, deliberate exit beneath the bright studio lights and the silent stares of a crowd, no longer sure whom they were meant to be applauding. The security guards flanked him, but never touched him. They didn't need to. He walked tall, composed, and unshaken. The moment wasn't chaotic. It was surgical, controlled, a scalpel to the heart of late-night pretenses. Jimmy stood at his desk, eyes locked on the floor. He attempted a chuckle, that practiced reflex of deflection. "Well," he said into the void, "I guess he doesn't like punchlines." It fell flat. A few in the crowd laughed, but most didn't. They were too busy processing what they'd just seen or already posting about it online. Clips from audience phones were going viral before Matt even reached the building's exit. The hashtags formed instantly. Walsh walkout, Kimmel clash, live meltdown. Backstage, producers scrambled. They debated cutting the segment entirely from the official broadcast, but the damage was already done. Matt's team had captured the raw feed through a pre-cleared taping agreement. He wasn't just walking out of a studio, he was walking into a public narrative already shifting in real time. Commentators online were split but engaged. Some called Matt dangerous, others called him brave. But everyone agreed. Late Night had just witnessed something real, and reality, unscripted and uncontained, doesn't fade quietly. Jimmy, trying to reclaim his rhythm, stumbled through the next guest's introduction, but the laughter never returned to the room. It had followed Matt out the door, and it wasn't coming back. By the time Matt Walsh reached his waiting car, the confrontation had already hit the headlines. Independent media ran with it first, releasing unedited audience footage showing the exact moment tensions erupted. Within an hour, major outlets picked it up. Matt Walsh storms off Kimmel's set, one headline read. Another said, Kimmel guest escorted out after heated clash over values. But those who watched the clips knew Matt hadn't stormed. He hadn't even raised his voice. He'd walked. The network's damage control was immediate. A spokesperson issued a carefully neutral statement. Last night's show took an unexpected turn. We thank Mr. Walsh for his appearance and remain committed to conversations of all kinds. But no one was buying it. Critics called it spin. Viewers called it cowardice. And Jimmy? He remained conspicuously silent, letting others clean up the mess. Behind the scenes, network executives were in full crisis mode. Phone calls flew between legal teams and PR firms. The ratings might spike for the episode, but the brand had taken a hit, and everyone knew it. Meanwhile, Matt did what no one expected. He said nothing. No tweets, no interviews, no sound bites, just silence. It made his supporters louder. He walked into hostile territory and kept his integrity, wrote one commentator. Others compared the moment to past late-night breakdowns, but noted the difference here. There was no meltdown, no theatrics, just a refusal to play along. And in an age where outrage is currency, Matt's quiet exit made the loudest noise of all. In the days that followed, Jimmy Kimmel's reputation began to crack. Not in one explosive collapse, but in a slow, steady erosion. Clips of the confrontation circulated endlessly, but so did older moments. Past interviews were reanalyzed. Former guests resurfaced in comment threads, recounting how the charming persona seen on screen didn't always match the off-camera man. A few even hinted they'd experienced the same condescension, the same smirking ambush, just without the cameras catching what Matt had refused to tolerate. Jimmy finally addressed the incident in a monologue 3 nights later. It was half apology, half dismissal. Things got a little tense earlier this week, he said, forcing a smile. Apparently some people don't know how to take a joke. There were laughs, but not many. Even his core audience could feel the deflection. The apology, if it was one, felt performative, insincere. And for many watching, it confirmed what Matt had said all along, that behind the smirk was a mask, and behind the mask was a man losing grip. Inside the network, the mood shifted. Producers reported rising discomfort among staff. Crew members began whispering more freely about Jimmy's temperament. It was always tense, one admitted to an industry blog. Matt just had the guts to respond on air. That sentiment echoed across social media. Walsh's silence was working in his favor, drawing contrast to Jimmy's defensive spin. The power dynamics of late-night TV had shifted. Not in a headline, not in a viral clip, but in perception. And perception, once lost, rarely returns intact. Inside the network's executive offices, the tone had shifted from irritation to alarm. The incident was no longer just a PR problem, it was becoming a credibility crisis. Advertisers reached out privately, requesting clarification on how the situation was being handled. A few quietly paused their upcoming spots. It's not the content, one sponsor reportedly said. It's the instability. And instability was now the one thing no one could deny. Staffers inside the Jimmy Kimmel Live production unit were suddenly emboldened. Whispers that had long circulated now turned into formal complaints. A segment producer submitted an HR memo describing a culture of sarcasm that borders on hostility when unfiltered. A camera operator confided to trade press, People walk on eggshells. This isn't new, it's just finally public. Matt Walsh hadn't planned a takedown, but his refusal to bend had exposed a long, hidden fracture. Meanwhile, ratings began to wobble. The viral clip had delivered an initial spike, but in the following episodes, viewership dipped. The shift wasn't massive, but it was noticeable. More telling were the social comments. Not watching anymore. He lost his cool. The smugness isn't funny when it's real. Kimmel's team scrambled to rebook lighter, friendlier guests, hoping to reset the tone. But each new episode felt haunted by the one moment they couldn't erase. The moment where the host was no longer in control. Matt's camp stayed silent, still declining interviews. The restraint, strategically or sincerely, had turned him from antagonist to something else entirely. A man who'd walked into the lion's den and walked out unburned, while the studio behind him smoldered. Within 2 weeks, media analysts began calling it a turning point, not just for Kimmel, but for the entire late-night landscape. The Walsh confrontation had become a symbol, cited in op-eds and industry panels as proof that the old formula was cracking. Hosts once untouchable were now under scrutiny. Audiences once predictable were fracturing. And the rules of engagement, once controlled from behind the desk, were now dictated by whoever had the courage to stand up, even mid-show. Other networks took notice. Quietly, producers at rival talk shows began reassessing their guest protocols. One showrunner, speaking anonymously, said, "That moment with Walsh, that wasn't just bad optics, that was a warning." Suddenly, there was talk of rebalancing tone, of limiting ambush-style segments, of getting back to the conversation instead of the takedown. No one was saying it aloud, but the fear was real. No one wanted to be the next Kimmel. Matt Walsh, meanwhile, finally resurfaced, not on cable, not on a victory tour, but at a quiet speaking engagement at a Midwest university. When asked directly about the incident, he didn't offer sound bites. "I wasn't trying to create a moment," he said. "I was trying to survive one." The audience applauded, not thunderously, but steadily. He hadn't become a hero to all, but he had become something rarer, a figure whose restraint spoke louder than outrage. And in a media environment hungry for performance, the refusal to perform had turned out to be the most disarming act of all. The moment Matt Walsh stood up and walked off that stage wasn't just a rupture in programming, it was a reckoning. For years, late night had existed on the illusion of comfort. Jokes that passed for critique, conversations choreographed to avoid real conflict. But this wasn't an illusion anymore. This was the collapse of the script. And whether viewers agreed with Walsh or not, they couldn't unsee what had happened when one guest refused to play along. Jimmy Kimmel's show limped forward. Ratings settled into a new, uncertain normal. Some viewers returned, others never did. But the invincibility was gone. His monologues, once hailed as cultural commentary, now drew side-eyes for tone. The smugness, once marketed as cleverness, had been exposed, not by a meltdown, not by a scandal, but by a man who sat still, spoke plainly, and didn't blink. The power dynamic had flipped, and it hadn't flipped back. So what do you think? Was Matt Walsh justified, or did Jimmy Kimmel just ask the wrong question? Was this a guest overstepping, or a host finally being confronted with the limits of his stagecraft? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, hit that subscribe button, and tell me who you want covered next. Because Hollywood is changing, the masks are slipping, and the real stories, the ones they never planned for, are only just beginning.